This is Hood Politics. This episode examines the interconnected lives and deaths of Andrew Bender III and his father, Andrew Bender II, a man known on the streets as Bubs from the neighborhood Compton Crips. The anatomy of the crime unfolds from a series of established facts. On the morning of Wednesday, January 27, 2016, shortly before 9 a.m., a 19-year-old named Andrew Bender III was walking with his friend, Adele, down Cedar Street, heading toward a local market. They soon encountered a man named Cornell on the sidewalk. An exchange took place, a question of affiliation. Cornell identified himself as being from Nutty Block, Compton. Andrew and his friends stated they were from neighborhood Compton Crips, and the two groups parted ways. But on their return from the store, a figure emerged from behind them, armed, and the quiet morning was shattered by gunfire. Andrew was struck repeatedly, collapsing to the pavement. Adele fled, but a glance back revealed a chilling sight: the gunman standing over Andrew's fallen body. The assailant then sprinted to a gold Dodge Avenger and vanished from the area. Once he reached a place of safety, Adele dialed 911. In less than a minute, the sirens of police and paramedics filled the air. They discovered Andrew on the ground, his body riddled with 10 bullets. He was rushed to a hospital for emergency surgery and placed on life support, clinging to life. As medical teams fought to save him, detectives descended upon the scene to begin the painstaking work of their investigation. They moved through the neighborhood, canvassing for witnesses. One man, who chose to remain anonymous, recounted hearing the shots while relaxing inside his home. He reported looking through his window to see a man with a silver handgun running down the street, leaving Andrew motionless on the ground. Another resident, a woman named Monica, also heard the chaos erupt. Her gaze out the window caught a man hurrying toward a yellowish car. She observed him clutching at his pants, appearing to conceal an object in his waistband before getting into the vehicle, which then sped off. The investigation led authorities to surveillance footage from a residence nearby, which provided a cold, silent account of the attack. The video showed the two friends, Andrew and Adele, on their walk home. It also captured Cornell getting into the Avenger and pulling it over to the side of the road, waiting. Moments later, the footage shows the gunman running from across the street, targeting Andrew and Adele in a sudden, violent ambush. The shooter is then seen entering the waiting Avenger, which quickly fled. The search for both Cornell and the gunman was now underway. There was a fragile hope that Andrew would survive his catastrophic injuries, but it was a hope that would not last. 2 weeks after the shooting, on Tuesday, February 9th, Andrew Bender III was pronounced dead, just 9 days before what would have been his 20th birthday. Known to his loved ones as Head, Andrew was a product of Compton, born and raised in its complicated embrace. His childhood began with sports at age 5, but it was football that captured his soul. He poured everything he had into the game, at times playing for 2 different leagues simultaneously. But as he grew, the allure of the streets began to pull at him. His father, Andrew Bender II, was a deeply respected member of the neighborhood Compton Crips, where he was known as Lil Bubs. It was a path the son would follow. Andrew III joined the neighborhood set, adopting his father's street name, Bubs, as his own. His mother, Tiffany, saw the shadow of the streets falling over him, a life that threatened his dream of reaching the NFL. In a desperate attempt to protect him and preserve his future in football, she relocated the family from Compton during his 10th grade year. She enrolled him in Poly High School in Long Beach, a school renowned for its elite football program. Andrew made the team and excelled, but his ambitions were derailed by persistent back problems that forced him to miss his entire senior season. After graduating in 2014, he enrolled in Long Beach City College. But life intervened when he learned his girlfriend was pregnant. He made the difficult choice to leave his education behind, taking a job as a security guard to support his growing family. A few months after Andrew was killed, his daughter was born. In the wake of the tragedy, Adele confided in Tiffany, Andrew's mother. He gave her a name, a 36-year-old member of the Atlantic Drive Compton Crips named Anthony King. His street name was AWOL, and according to Adele, he was the man who had pulled the trigger. Tiffany found a photograph of Anthony and presented it to Adele, asking, "Is this the man that killed my son?" Adele's confirmation was simple and devastating. Yes, this was the critical piece of information she delivered to investigators. The neighborhood Compton Crips and the Atlantic Drive Compton Crips had not always been enemies. They were once part of a powerful alliance bound together with the Kelly Park and Southside Compton Crips. These 4 sets shared deep connections through family and friendship. and for decades they had stood shoulder to shoulder against rival Piru gangs. The complex history of this broken brotherhood was articulated by B.G. Scarface, a prominent figure from Atlantic Drive who had been featured on the Banging on Wax music compilations, who spoke about the profound bond these gangs once shared. Is greater than. Everybody you grew up with, just one pack. One pack broke off to Inhood, one pack broke off to Kelly Park, one pack broke off to Southside, and I broke off to Atlantic Drive. You see what I'm saying? Everybody just grow up. You lose somebody from that pack, you retaliate on the other side. You know what I'm saying? Kelly Parks wear blue and green. The Inhoods wear blue and orange. Southids wear blue and gold. We wear pot of blue and dark blue. You know what I'm saying? At that time, everyone was a Crip. His friends, the young women he knew, all of them were deeply entrenched in the gang's culture. Even the children, a 12-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 5-year-old, they were all immersed in that life, to its fullest and most dangerous extent. There was a pervasive indifference to consequence. In the early 2000s, this volatile chemistry led to an internal collapse, and the alliance fell apart. Observers noted that the schism wasn't caused by a single event, but rather a cascade of smaller conflicts that, over time, inevitably erupted into gunfire. The once unified organization fractured, cleaving into two warring factions, Neighborhood and Kelly Park on one side, with Southside and Atlantic Drive forming an opposing front. Figures from both sides attempted to broker a truce and reunite the factions, but the efforts were futile. By April of 2007, they were at war. An 18-year-old man named Jamal Mahone and his brother, Matthew, attended a party. Both brothers were affiliated with the neighborhood set. While at the gathering, they confronted members of Southside, and a physical altercation ensued. The Southside members then challenged Jamal and Matthew to a second confrontation at South Park. Later that night, a crowd of approximately 50 people had assembled at the park when Jamal and Matthew arrived with a contingent of about 30. The two groups then organized a series of one-on-one fights to settle their disputes. Jamal was defeated in his bout, while his brother Matthew managed to knock out a Southside member named Albert Beckley, who went by the name Bluebird. Weeks later, on May 14th, at around 8 o'clock in the evening, Jamal, Matthew, and several others were gathered on Pauline Street, deep within neighborhood territory. Moments later, a silver vehicle descended the street. From the window, Albert Beckley aimed a firearm and opened fire on the group. A woman was grazed in the forehead and shot in the foot. Jamal was struck in the chest and succumbed to his injuries at the scene. The subsequent investigation led to the arrests of Albert and the driver, another Southside affiliate named Daryl Finn. Finn, also known by the moniker Lil Freaky, was charged alongside Albert with Jamal's murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Both Albert and Daryl received sentences of 50 years to life in prison. On February 7, 2009, a man named Anthony brandished a weapon against a member of Kelly Park named Will, issuing a threat. Will reported the incident to a fellow Kelly Park member, William, and together they began to hunt for Anthony. Their search led them to a local liquor store called Jack Rabbit, where they located a 21-year-old Atlantic Drive member named James Hampton, known as Tiny C, sitting inside his vehicle in the parking lot. Will exited his car armed with an AK-47, ran toward James's vehicle, and shot him to death. William would later plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter, for which he received a sentence of 13 years in prison. Will was tried and found guilty of murder, resulting in a sentence of 55 years to life. In the years following the internal collapse, Neighborhood forged a strategic alliance with Southside's most bitter rival, the Santana Block Compton Crips. In 2013, a member of Santana Block, who went by the nickname Molly, released a track titled I'm From Compton. The song was a collaboration featuring rappers from Anzac, Grape, Compton, and Neighborhood, and its lyrics were a direct taunt to Southside and other rival gangs. Andrew can be clearly seen in the music video, displaying Neighborhood hand signs and openly disrespecting Southside. On May 5, 2014, 2 members of Southside 18-year-old Omar Williams and 20-year-old Jason Pena were driving down the street. An SUV pulled alongside them, a window lowered, and a gunman inside opened fire. Omar and Jason were hit multiple times. Their vehicle spun out of control and collided with other cars. Omar was pronounced dead at the scene. Jason was transported to a nearby hospital, where he later died from his wounds. Investigators believe the shooting was the work of a joint operation between members of Neighborhood and Santana Block. The war had escalated, leaving a trail of bodies and dozens of shootings. Several weeks after Andrew's murder, detectives brought Adele in for questioning. He stated that he wanted no involvement and claimed to have seen nothing. Detectives pressed him, presenting him with a photographic lineup. He reacted with a laugh when he saw photo number 3, the picture of Anthony. After viewing all 6 photographs, he offered a cryptic message to the detectives. "Break off numbers 5 and 6, and y'all do the rest, man." Investigators then located Cornell and brought him in for his own interview. His initial story was one of complete denial. He claimed to know nothing about the shooting and insisted he wasn't even in the area when it happened. But his narrative crumbled after investigators informed him that eyewitnesses placed him at the scene and that they possessed video evidence of him getting into the Avenger and driving the shooter away. Cornell then provided a new version of the events on the day of the shooting. He claimed he was standing outside his grandmother's residence when Andrew and Adele approached and questioned him about his gang affiliation. He identified himself as being from Nutty Block, and they told him they were from Neighborhood. There was no known conflict between the two sets, so Andrew and Adele went on their way. According to this new account, he then entered the Avenger and drove down the street. When investigators questioned him about the man who entered his car, he identified him as Anthony King. He explained that his grandmother lived just one house away from Anthony's in-laws, making him a familiar face. Cornell asserted he was simply sitting in the Avenger, listening to music and looking at his phone, when Anthony suddenly ran to the car and asked for a ride to the grocery store. Cornell agreed to the request, dropping Anthony at a storefront a few blocks from the area. He would later claim that he was unaware of the shooting, insisting he only learned of it much later in the day. 3 days later, authorities arrested Anthony and charged him with the murder of Andrew Bender. In an interrogation room, detectives began pressing him for details. Anthony flatly denied any involvement, claiming he was nowhere near the location at the time of the incident. However, investigators secured a search warrant for his cell phone, and the data told a different story, placing him at the scene when the shots were fired. While incarcerated, Anthony placed a call to his wife, Sandy, who informed him that authorities had only managed to find one of his cell phones. She was in possession of the others. 4 days after that call, investigators brought Sandy in for questioning, specifically asking her about the other phones. She admitted to them that she had destroyed the devices in a fire pit. Not long after, another call came from the jail. Anthony was recorded lamenting his decision to keep the phone, saying he should have thrown it into the ocean that day. If he had, he reasoned, they would have nothing to worry about. This evidence proved critical, and Anthony was ultimately found guilty of murder in the death of Andrew Bender III, along with related gun charges. On October 16, 2018, Anthony King received his sentence, 80 years to life in prison. The uneasy alliance between the neighborhood and Kelly Park crews persisted, but over the years, that bond had been severely tested. On December 5, 2021, Andrew's father, Andrew Bender II, drove to the home of a man named Marlon to have some work done on his vehicle. A man named Michael, who lived in a trailer behind Marlon's house, was known throughout the area as the local mechanic. The residence was situated deep in the heart of Kelly Park territory and was a known gathering spot for the gang. At around 12 p.m., Andrew and Michael were preparing to head to an auto parts store when a 49-year-old Kelly Park member, Lawrence Stackhouse, confronted Andrew in the driveway, saying, "I heard you killed my father." Andrew's reply was cautious. "I didn't kill your father," he said, "but I was in the car with the men that did. That's past me now. I'm moving forward. I don't want to talk about that no more." With that, Andrew and Michael got into Andrew's SUV and drove toward the auto parts store. During the drive, Andrew reached into the center console and retrieved a handgun. When Michael asked what was wrong, Andrew just said, "Nothing," and placed the weapon on the seat beside him. A short time later, they returned to the house and saw Lawrence's Dodge Charger parked in the driveway. Michael did not know Lawrence on a personal level, but he recognized him as a well-respected member of Kelly Park. As they drew nearer to the house, they saw several other gang members standing outside, waiting. Andrew and Michael exited the SUV and walked toward the backyard to get back to work on the car. Michael observed Lawrence speaking with a woman named Sharekika in the driveway. A few minutes passed before Andrew left the backyard, walked to his SUV, and retrieved his gun. He held it down by his side, glaring at Lawrence and Sharekika as he walked back. Sensing the escalating tension, Michael went inside the house to warn Marlon that a problem was brewing outside. When Michael stepped back out, Shirekika told him Andrew was acting erratically. The confrontation had clearly enraged Lawrence. He drew a pistol from his waistband and laid it on the hood of his car. Michael's attempts to de-escalate the situation were futile. Lawrence snatched his weapon, got into his car, and sped away. Michael then returned to the backyard where he and Andrew tried to continue working on the vehicle. Michael warned Andrew to watch his back. At around 8 a.m. the following morning, Andrew arrived back at Marlon's house and woke Michael to finish the car repairs. As Michael worked, Andrew sat on a pile of bricks. There had been significant police activity in the area, so he stashed his gun in a nearby plastic tub, hiding it under some clothing. At around 8:30, Michael heard the distinct sound of Lawrence's Charger. He looked down the street and saw the car drive past the house before making a slow U-turn. The vehicle came to a stop in front of the driveway. Lawrence stepped out, a gun already in his hand, and began advancing on Andrew. Andrew turned to run, and Lawrence opened fire, striking him in the back. Wounded, Andrew turned to face his attacker, his hands raised in surrender. Lawrence continued his deliberate approach and shot him 3 more times in the stomach and chest. As Andrew collapsed to the ground, Lawrence walked back to his vehicle. Michael screamed, "What the hell are you doing, man?" Lawrence's reply was chillingly calm. "You all right?" he asked Michael. He then got into his car and fled the scene. The gunshots brought Marlon's son, Marlo, running outside. The dying Andrew ordered him to get his gun and shoot back. Marlo ran to the plastic tub and grabbed the weapon. He sprinted into the middle of the street and took aim at Lawrence's fleeing car, but Michael grabbed him, telling him not to shoot. Michael then dialed 911, and within minutes, police and paramedics swarmed the scene. Andrew was transported to the hospital, where he succumbed to his injuries during emergency surgery. An examination revealed that 3 of the 4 gunshot wounds he had sustained were fatal. 3 months after the shooting, detectives brought Michael in for an interview. He was initially hesitant to speak, paralyzed by the fear of retaliation. His resolve finally broke. He confessed to detectives what he had witnessed, naming Lawrence as the one who shot Andrew. Investigators then produced a photographic array, with Lawrence's image placed among the others. There was no hesitation. Michael pointed directly to Lawrence's picture, confirming he was the gunman. In August of 2022, authorities moved in. Lawrence was arrested and formally charged with Andrew's murder. Behind closed doors, detectives began their interrogation regarding the shooting. Lawrence's account was a wall of denial. He claimed to have no knowledge of the event and insisted he was nowhere in the vicinity of Marlon's house when the shooting occurred. A search of the vehicle he had been operating turned up a key piece of evidence: a 9mm handgun. Executing a search warrant on his home, they uncovered a more disturbing cache: a bulletproof vest and a second 9mm handgun, found concealed within a ski mask alongside 2 ammunition magazines. The Dodge Charger believed to have been used in the crime was located inside his garage and was promptly seized by law enforcement. An analysis of the Charger's onboard GPS system painted a damning picture, placing the vehicle near the crime scene on the day of the murder. This digital evidence led investigators to secure a warrant for Lawrence's cell phone. The cell phone data provided further corroboration. Records indicated the device connected to 2 separate cell towers in close proximity to the shooting, not only on the day of the murder, but also on the preceding day. After weighing the evidence presented, a jury delivered its verdict. Lawrence was found guilty of the murder of Andrew Bender II, in addition to multiple firearm offenses. On February 8, 2023, the court handed down its judgment. Lawrence Stackhouse was sentenced to serve 29 years to life in prison. We appreciate you joining this investigation. Please show your support by liking, commenting, and subscribing. The tragic saga of the Bender family isn't just a headline. It is a profound cautionary tale about the toxic gravity of the streets and the hollow promise of gang loyalty. For decades, a broken brotherhood in Compton turned childhood friends into sworn enemies, proving that in the world of shadows, today's alliance is tomorrow's ambush. The most heartbreaking reality is the vicious cycle of inheritance. Andrew Bender III followed his father's footsteps into the same neighborhood set, even adopting his moniker. Despite a mother's desperate prayers and a cross-city move to save him through football, the pull of the streets remained a siren song that eventually silenced his dreams. 2 generations, 2 lives claimed by the same concrete, leaving behind a daughter who will only know her father as a memory in a case file. The lesson is clear. Violence is a debt that never gets settled, It only collects interest in the form of human life. True strength isn't found in a hand sign or a weapon, but in the courage to break the chain before it breaks you. We must choose to build legacies of life, education, and peace, so the next generation isn't born into a war they didn't start. Let this story be the wake-up call. The streets don't love you back. They only wait for your turn.